I'm really appreciative of the talk, but I'm kind of wondering if you're not stuck sort of in a intellectual bifurcation, which on the one hand I really agree with you. So you've got the modernists and the belief in technoscience and the facts, values, and all these. So I agree with all your critiques, but then I also understand the counter critique. We need to talk about values, and it's about local and participation and giving voice to the underdog and the marginalized. I feel this is a debate. This has been going on for a long time. It reminds me of the debate of ecological modernization, so in the 90s, was precisely the same sort of two strands.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit my feeling, that I'm sympathetic to the critique, but I'm not convinced that rehearsing the critique and sort of we need to we need to talk about values and maybe about sustainability. What is sustainability? Because you know that debate's been had for 20 years and that does not get us anywhere either.
Yeah.
So this is a little bit, is there not a third way? Can we not escape sort of this dichotomy of either being sort of modernist and scientific, or this more critical and then the belief, because I do think we need to have big change happening somehow if we take this problem serious. And I mean, this picture around sitting around the fire sounds very nice and cozy, but I'm not sure if that's going to bring us the change we need fast enough, or the other example is more about adaptation rather than mitigation. So I'm still a bit puzzled, how do we, or have you given up maybe on the idea of mitigation? And if we do need mitigation, we need to change somehow, and it's either technologies or maybe behavior change, but we don't really know how that happens. So this is already my corner. I'm sympathetic, but I do feel this sounds very sort of familiar, this two-track approach with the modernist and then the critique, and I'm just not sure where this is going to get us.
I have a couple of responses to that. I think these are old arguments, and I think it is quite depressing that we have to rehearse them in the present. In this case, I think we really do have to rehearse them, because if, as I've been trying to do, if you scrutinise a whole raft of publications, a whole raft of policy documents and plans, it is really striking how the human dimensions of global environmental change are being explicitly and implicitly coded as a sort of techno-managerial issue. I mean, it's kind of graphically evident. You don't have to look too hard to see that. So for some reason, different ways of thinking about human dimensions and the role of science and technology in changing those human dimensions, those kind of arguments are not getting traction within those wider geoscience communities. So that's the first thing to say. So I agree, but I think it's still relevant to keep saying these things. The second thing then about change is really about what are the mechanisms to get people in positions of kind of intellectual responsibility, never mind the kind of political decision-making, authority stuff, so academics, researchers, intellectual responsibility, how to get them to change their behaviours and their habits. Now, I don't have any quick answer to that, but I think what is striking is that 3 of the 4 global change research programmes that I showed the little emblems for at the start, going back 30 years, have been heavily dominated by geoscientists, and where they're not geoscientists, they're social scientists who are at the sort of science end of social science. So, is it about changing the networks? Is it about having sustained interactions around kind of identifiable problems, which is what of course happened to Stuart Lane and Sarah Watmore and those guys on that local Pickering problem? There's probably no new thinking there, but I think the key thing is something has to happen. It has to be very practical. And it has to be about breaking those networks and changing the way people think about what they're doing, their professional modus operandi in the geoscience world. So, one of the worries that someone like Clive Hamilton, the Australian philosopher, has expressed is that this sense of urgency it might be driving some geoscientists towards, some pretty wacky experiments, and geoengineering is the one that's getting all the debate at the moment. And so, however well-intentioned, that's probably not where we need to go. And so, we need to do other things to kind of change it up.
Thank you. Any more questions?
And would you say, one can say that previously there's, in terms of dissemination of knowledge, there's too much focus on the actual product or the publication of science rather than the process while doing the science? Because I was thinking of that when you mentioned the example of flat wrist, and that this urban experiments engaged the community and made these voices heard, and so also the knowledge generated was more relevant for people living in that community. Maybe also that would help the dissemination and also impact of the studies.
Well, I think you're right that if you're going to try to foster new intellectual practices with different sort of practical outcomes, then that is a question of time, and it's also a question of money. You need to give people the opportunity to kind of slightly unlearn the habits that they've acquired through their PhD and their research career and do something new. And I think one thing we have to acknowledge actually is that in many of the projects funded under the 4 global research, environmental change research programs, actually there were a lot of attempts to have sustained interaction between biologists and anthropologists, for example. So I don't want to get into caricaturing and saying that that was all very sort of science technology driven and nothing changed. Things did change, resources were made available, but now that global change research is in a new phase under the umbrella of Future Earth, there has to be time and resource to bring in, I think, ways of looking at the world, particularly critical social science and the wider environmental humanities, in ways that actually make it relevant to what geoscientists are doing. So it can't be sort of parked over there as coming after the science, or even before the science, but not part of the scientific process. You see what I mean? And that's the kind of thing that Bruno Latour and other people have been trying to help us think about, is a new way of thinking about those old academic divisions of labour, albeit in quite abstract ways in Latour's case. So.
Thanks. We had a question at the front first.
I'm always a fan of academics advocating that academics are more normative or engaged, or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you say. Just to pick up on what's happening in Australia right now, you and I follow it closely, but just yesterday the Australian Prime Minister announced that they were going to cut funding for lots of these Aboriginal communities, and I don't know if the Arnhem Land lot are among that. I suppose the reason I'm raising that particular anecdote is the question of how we can create states that are responsive, enabling and capable of acting with the speed and the subtlety that is required. And our record as academics and social movements is quite frankly not very good. And at the beginning, just very quickly, at the beginning of climate concern in Australia in the late 80s, the sympathetic Labour government launched this thing called ecologically sound development, and the idea was that you would get everyone around the table, you would have the social movements, you would have the academics, and you would also have business, and they would figure out what was needed and create a policy to do it. And what happened is there was a change of leadership, and the new leader just threw it in the bin, and this has been thrown down the memory hole. And there are constant examples of well-meaning academics and well-meaning social movement people who believe that they can democratise the state. But there's no evidence that you can democratise an advanced Western capitalist state that I'm aware of. I mean, you get niche successes with wind power in Denmark, but it's pissing in the wind. No pun intended.
Yeah, I think those are fair points. Maybe to be slightly more positive, at the risk of being extraordinarily naive, there's obviously been a lot of criticism over the years of the Kyoto process, and the infamous Copenhagen meeting is the one where everyone put their head in their hands and just thought, this is just not going to work. But we might be more positive, because one plus point of Kyoto, even though it failed, is what it demonstrated is that with a generally global scale problem, with emissions coming from all over the planet, you can actually get governments around the table on a sustained basis. I mean, how many COP meetings have there been? The Paris one is going to be number
21.
Right, 21.
Oh, sorry, 20.
So that's an achievement of sorts, and I think it's interesting if you look at the way a lot of political scientists who are looking at global environmental change, where they're focusing their energies, they're focusing not on the national scale, so the electoral cycle and the fact that policies are getting reversed every 3 or 4 years. They're focusing, understandably, on the global scale. So John Dryzek, who's at the ANU, is doing some kind of, it's quite techy, but it's quite interesting work on a kind of new global governance arrangements for the environment that might actually lock in some of these commitments. So I do risk being naive saying that, but I think there is a kind of track record there with the Kyoto process that might actually just lay the foundations with the kind of urgent messages coming out of geoscience, for something a bit more, got a bit more traction looking ahead in terms of environmental policy.
I think I've got a question from Maria then, Eric.
Thank you, Noel. I found it really stimulating at the deep level, intellectual level, because, okay, what I understood, and maybe I read it completely wrong, maybe I'm projecting my own, is you're talking about intellectual responsibility more than anything else here. And you really, for me, this is asking, is there any scope for intellectual debate to intervene and change the world? And you, again, my understanding is that you suggest, correct me if I'm wrong, that a possible way of doing it, or a way forward even, you're proposing, is to break through those networks that are already established and put forward new ideas and an agenda that will, so, okay. I think this is something to, worth doing anyway. However, whether it's going to change the world, I don't know, and I wonder what this change the world thing, or the climate, whether we're looking at the wrong end on that side. So if we were to shift viewpoint and talk not about breaking networks, existing networks, but to talk about how do these ideas reach out and become not an intellectual discourse, or how do concepts or intellectual discourses become collective imaginaries and therefore have gain a momentum which can then change the world. And these are two very different processes. But because we do have examples of intellectual debates or concepts that did break through the networks, and all that happens is that they get immediately incorporated in the networks. Carbon trading is one of many such examples. It had the noble desire from those who established it to give something back to the developing world, and all it did is to start trading, give a lot of millions to the City of London and relative financial institutions. So I was wondering what would happen to your analysis if you were to look at it from a different viewpoint of whether reaching a different audience or breaking through different types of networks than those on power. Because if you bring in the question of power, as it were, to all this, what would that change?
That's quite a big question.
Yes.
What can you say about that?
Yeah, my question is very similar, actually, and coming at it from a different sort of way. It's a fantastic talk. It's a bit hermetic in the sense that it talks about scientists and what scientists do. And you make a case, which I would fully support, as Maria puts it, for certain heterodox perspectives to get a greater traction to transform the hegemonic global environmental science configuration. That's a bit of a binary situation in certain ways. In my experience, global environmental science specialists are very heterogeneous people. Yeah? Some I can talk to without any difficulty. We're like this. With others, we just agree to disagree. There's no communication possible, irrespective of the very different epistemological and ontological perspectives that they may use. Your argument towards the end is that it is up to us, to what we as academics, scientists do, how we engage in our research, what kind of networks we get involved in, as if the continuation of a particular hegemonic view of doing things depends on us. That it is up to us scientists, academics, of what we do. And that's where my doubt starts creeping in, so to speak. In the sense that the continuous hegemony of a particular way of framing government is as much constituted in and through the institutions of governance, everyday policy making, values, etc. And the question therefore in terms of tactics of change is it not therefore imperative for us scientists, academics, to ally ourselves with other actors and agents within the wider fabric of the social that push towards the transformation. Because I don't think it's purely a question of competing epistemologies, perspectives, etc.
No.
It is as much to do with the wider embedding of the scientific enterprise, so to speak, of Science Inc. within the configuration.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree with that, and with what Maria said. I was actually simply sort of bracketing that, as it were, to focus on a set of changes afoot in this kind of community of communities, this network of networks. And maybe where I disagree with you, actually, I mean, I agree with you, but where I sort of disagree with you, I think we do actually have to focus here, is that I don't think we should allow these changes to roll on as if we can't do anything about them. Because we can. And so I'll give you an example of this. For me, one of the really striking things about the way many environmental humanists have responded to the idea of the Anthropocene is to carry on doing exactly what they've always done. Writing very esoteric papers for each other in the last 3 to 4 years. And not actually doing what they should do, is taking those arguments and making them accessible in a way that makes a difference to the way geoscientists understand what they're doing when they author manifestos about the Anthropocene and the need for planetary management. So I think that's there to be done. That's why things, the details matter. The fact that it's Franz Berkow and not someone else. The fact that Bina's on it. It's that level of human interactions on these committees and these networks that I think doesn't necessarily make some kind of difference to that intellectual framing. So that's one thing I'm going to say. The second thing I'm going to say, linking now to the wider context, is I think she's a bit naive, but in this one respect, Naomi Klein does, in her book, see climate scientists specifically as fifth columnists, using the authority of science to challenge the system from within, speaking truth to power. Okay? That's a bit naive, but on the other hand, I think the reason she does that, and I'm reading between the lines, is I think she just looks at the wider political landscape and she doesn't see enough pressure for change out there all by itself. So she looks to science and says, actually, bloody hell, this is a resource for people who want to change things. Even though, of course, science aims as much as it can to be, objective and value-free and all the rest of it. So, again, I come back to why I think it is important to kind of get involved in this evolving discussion of what global change is, what it should be achieving. But then maybe to come back to Maria's point about, reframing it, looking at it from the other end. I don't really know. But one thing I would make mention of, and I think there's a lot of criticisms of these guys, but Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus in the United States and the Breakthrough Institute, they've got this agenda where they say we've got a lot of climate change skeptics out there in the population. On the other hand, we've got a lot of people who want to change the world in all sorts of really interesting ways. So let's stop talking about global environmental change. Let's actually talk about things that matter to people and inspire them, motivate them. So jobs, schools, good neighbourhood, good quality of relationships with your neighbours, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a question there about political agendas around messaging that's very much without the global change science community. But like Naomi Klein, I just don't see that kind of political programme manifesting in ways that are going to change the political landscape in Britain or the States or Canada or Germany or anywhere else like that. So I think that's why Klein's book is actually quite a despondent book at the end of the day, because I think she herself recognises that.
Yeah, just a question regarding the content of the talk, which was very, very stimulating. You don't really ever mention the problem of climate change scientists actually talking to policymakers, because from what I understand, well, I mean, it was sort of alluded to earlier, but, reports are given, and then they're essentially told to rewrite them to make them sound better. So, is it really, and the part of the problem is that, you have scientists talking to these sort of elites who are really only their responsibility is beholden to constituents who are kept ignorant. So why is it that, how does that sort of framework between those who are responsible and those who are providing information, it seems like the conversation's happening in a very backward way.
Yeah, no, I think thanks for mentioning that. That is a really important part of this story, and I think it's an important source of the frustration that people like Will Steffen at the ANU feel that the kind of messages that he and his colleagues want to communicate are constantly getting watered down and neutered because of the institutional arrangements that connect elements of geoscience into the policy world. So the IPCC is a great example. Report, was it number 3, came out last year. There was all sorts of stuff that came out, about self-censorship on the part of the authors. So I think that's an issue. What's encouraging though is I think a number of these networks now are trying to sort of go it alone and do things outside the formal policy process. So Stockholm Resilience people, lots of criticism of them, but they're kind of shouting out independently of the kind of political apparatuses like the IPCC that connect science into the policy world. The IBPES is new. It's going to be quite interesting to see the way in which people who do biodiversity research, essentially, ecosystem services research, actually start to articulate their research into policy. Because that's not yet really happened. It's not kind of it's not kind of nailed down yet. So, yeah, that relationship is really crucial, but I think the IPCC is just one part of that story. There are other things going on, and it can be done differently. And again, I don't want to be naive about that.
Let me say a little from some of my experience in other dimensions. As an academic, I trained many PhD students from the developing world. One of them was a girl called Asna van Wega, from Kenya, who studied soil erosion. But she became head of Action Aid program in Africa and asked me to help her make a submission to the Copenhagen COP on behalf of Action Aid. She organised that people went into squatter settlements that got frequently flooded in several African major cities, and we put together in the space of 2 months a report that went forward to the COP. It was helping people deal with the local consequences of global change, communicating. And it was interesting that a good example of proper geography that you did was from Pickering. It was a local case study. And I believe here in Manchester we can do good local work. Have a look, if you haven't looked at it, at the plan for the Mersey Forest. You can just Google Mersey Forest and look at the plan. It's all about what communities can do and what they're doing for it. It's a PhD from this school. He's partly written a lot of that, who works for them. And I think we have to remember that we have another option, in addition to writing articles for each other, in addition to inspiring students, to be active scientists and engage with NGOs and other sorts of organisations. And I think not everybody's going to do that, because it takes time out of other things in life. But you can make changes that raise the global problem and apply local solutions to it, because let's face it, it's our daily lives at the local scale that are responsible for the climate change. So if we improve local conditions, we're helping to improve climate change. So that's one experience that is relevant. The other one is I did have a lot of connection at one stage with ICSU, the International Council for Science, and some of the big shots who were on the Millennium Assessment and so on. And they used to say, oh yeah, we need a social scientist on this. And I said, well, why do you need it? Well, we need someone to work out how much it costs. To then, a social scientist was the economist. And it was quite fascinating that because I was a geographer, not a biologist or a geologist or a physicist or a chemist, I was often asked the questions about social science. And I know very little about social science. But it's how you're perceived in an environment at a certain sort of time. So you have a job to constantly educate people about these connections and try and make them happen and make them ask the right questions. And this constantly is necessary. You can be in a meeting with political people discussing an eco-city, and then you say, why are you doing that? Where's the sustainability in that? You've got to constantly keep it going and fight the battle. But unless you do, the future's not very good. But we can do things, and I think it's the things you can positively say we have achieved that are the things to count, not what we can't do.
But that's very much a bottom-up approach, isn't it? This is the point. If you're going to get somewhere with a political impulse, you work from the community level upward. I mean, I just happen to, I went to school in Pickering, I have relations still there, and I know how well received what was done, how well received it was. And when they've recently had problems with flooding, it wasn't half so bad.
So can I just follow up a bit? I think I did mention looking at the other end, but I mean, what I was getting at is that the boundaries and networks of localism and community practices are as difficult to surpass as the boundaries and the networks at the power holders. And what I was trying to get to is that it's as important to break the localist approaches. So the intellectual work is as important to break the localist approaches that can end into parochial politics, often do, as it is to break through the global networks. I think we're doing very little to that end, because much of academic work that works on the local community does just that. It's very difficult to break out of that and create this, what I call a collective imaginary for a change. There are very few. There are instances in recent human history that has been, like the five-day working week, for example. That was an idea that became practice only after it was internationalized. It couldn't be locally applied. I don't know if we have an example in environmental.
I mean, that cuts the other way, because I guess we're in a really unusual situation where we've got 7.5 billion people on the planet, but we've arranged things such that actually a pretty small number of people can set agendas for the totality of humanity. The Davos meeting every year tells you that. The UN, which is in many ways an amazing institution, but also does that, and there are risks with that. So that word responsibility, and it's also kind of authority and power. There is a degree of authority and power that's being enjoyed and will be enjoyed, I think, by these networks. Not necessarily that they see themselves that way. It just goes with the territory. So, like you said, with that idea of the 5-day week or the 8-hour day or whatever it is, getting certain ideas that could really change things, you've got to do it in those places where they're going to get disseminated out. And at the moment, there are lots of global arenas where you can do that. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think with this particular topic, that a lot of those networks you can actually get into them. I've talked to Bina about how she got on the Future Earth Steering Committee. Just got an email one day. There's no shenanigans about it. Will you come on? And so she has an opportunity, born out of that, that position, to do things differently with that group of people, and that will then have impacts on the whole programme, looking ahead 20 years.
Got any final questions or comments? Could join me in thanking Noel for such a wonderful talk.